My name is Marcus Riley, Sergeant Marcus Mac Riley, Oak Haven Police Department Special Weapons and Tactics. For 12 years, the stub 8 patch on my shoulder wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a creed, a promise. We were the sharpened edge, the last resort when civility broke down and chaos threatened to boil over. We trained for riots, hostage situations, active shooters, barricaded suspects, the worst humanity could throw at itself. We thought we'd seen it all, prepared for it all. We were wrong. So catastrophically, cosmically wrong. What happened starting yesterday morning, it wasn't in any manual. There's no training simulation for the end of the world. It began like any other dawn shift change. The stale smell of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner hung heavy in the ready room air, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows from the rows of heavy, duty lockers lining the walls. Outside, the pre-dawn sky over Oak Haven was still bruised purple and grey, promising another humid Midwestern summer day. Inside, there was the familiar ritual of gearing up. Click, clack of polymer magazines seating into rifle wells. The shuck of Velcro straps being cinched tight on body armor. The low murmur of voices, Ramirez checking the charge on his breaching ram. Chen meticulously cleaning the sight on his MP5. Booker grumbling good-naturedly about the Lakers game he missed. Lieutenant Davis, the LT, a rock, solid veteran with eyes that had seen too much but missed nothing, was reviewing the overnight sit, rep at the main desk, his brow furrowed. Standard procedure. Standard morning. My own station was organized chaos. M4 carbine, optics checked, laser zeroed. Saddam, a Glock 21 extra mags. Flashbangs, smoke grenades, breaching tools, zip cuffs, medical kit, the tools of the trade, heavy and reassuring. My plate carrier, ceramic plates front and back, felt like a familiar embrace, the weight settling comfortably on my shoulders. The helmet, comms unit integrated, sat ready. Each piece of gear represented a potential solution to a problem, a variable accounted for. We were problem solvers, surgeons operating on the malignant tumor of violence. All right, listen up. LT Davis's voice cut through the low din. He gathered around, grabbing lukewarm coffees. Quiet night, mostly. Couple of domestics, a BE downtown that patrol handled. Weather's clear. Intel reports nothing unusual brewing. Standard patrol pattern for Sector Charlie today, backup readiness for citywide. He paused, scanning our faces. Keep comms discipline tight. Stay hydrated. Anything pops off, we roll fast and hard. Questions, silence we knew. The drill. Gear up. Check each other out. Wheels up in 15. The routine continued. Double checks on armor weapons functions, comms links. Ramirez clapped me on the shoulder plate. Ready to dance, Sarge. Always, Ramirez. Just hope the music's slow today. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in his dark beard. Never is when we're on the clock. We loaded into the Bearcat, our armored transport. The hydraulic hiss of the rear door sealing us inside was another familiar sound, usually a signal that the sterile calm of the station was being left behind for the unpredictable streets. The engine rumbled to life, a deep, throated growl that vibrated through the steel floor. We rolled out into the waking city, streetlights just beginning to extinguish as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon. The first hour was uneventful. Radio chatter was routine, traffic stops, minor disputes. The usual urban symphony. We ran through some basic drills in the back of the Bearcat, muscle memory keeping us sharp. Chen was showing Booker a new rifle grip technique. Ramirez was field, stripping his shotgun for the 10th time that week. The man loved his scattergun. I monitored the dispatch channels, sipping water, letting the familiar rhythm lull the shift adrenaline. Then came the first call that pricked the edge of normalcy. Our units, reports of a highly aggressive individual. 1400 block of Elm Street. Multiple callers reporting extreme violence. Subject described as unresponsive to commands, possibly under the influence of unknown narcotics. Elm Street. Not the best part of town, but not the worst. Usually petty stuff, occasional drug busts. Highly aggressive, wasn't unusual. PCP could make people do crazy things, exhibit surprising strength. Dispatch, this is SWAT 1. LT Davis responded calmly into his mic. We're 10 minutes out from Elm. Advise patrol units to establish a perimeter. Do not engage directly unless absolutely necessary. Wait for our arrival. Roger that, SWAT 1. Patrol units en route. Advise to set up containment. The mood in the Bearcat shifted subtly. Drills stopped. Weapons were checked again. Silent nods were exchanged. This was potentially it, the reason we existed. As we approached Elm Street, the radio traffic started to get weird. Dispatch, Unit 12 on scene. Subject is hostile. Extremely hostile. Taser deployed, no effect. Repeat, taser ineffective. A pause, sounds of shouting, breaking glass in the background. Subject is biting Officer Miller. Shots fired! Shots fired! Unit 12 status! Unit 12 report! Dispatch crackled, urgency creeping into the operator's voice. Silence. Then, a different unit. Unit 15 arriving. Multiple subjects down. Civilians, my God, they're attacking each other! This isn't PCP. Dispatch? This is something else. SWAT 1 to all units on Elm. LT Davis's voice was tight, controlled. Establish hard perimeter. No one in or out. We are making entry. We rolled up to a scene rapidly devolving into chaos. Patrol cars were parked haphazardly, doors open, lights flashing. Civilians were running, screaming. Faces masks of terror. We saw 2 patrol officers backing away from an apartment building entrance, weapons drawn, shouting commands that were clearly being ignored. One officer had a crude bandage wrapped around his arm, already soaking through with red. All right, team, listen up. LT Davis barked as the Bearcat hissed to a stop. Ramirez, Chen, with me on entry. Booker, Mac, you have rear containment and overwatch. Standard breach protocol. Unknown number of hostiles, assume extreme aggression. Disregard conventional non-lethal responses based on reports. Rules of engagement are fluid, protect yourselves, protect civilians. Go! The rear door opened, and we poured out into Bedlam. The air tasted wrong, coppery, metallic, thick with fear. Screams echoed off the brick apartment buildings. Distant sirens wailed, a mournful chorus to the unfolding nightmare. Ramirez, Chen, and the LT formed a stack on the main entrance door of the apartment building, indicated by the panicked patrol officers. It was scarred, splintered near the lock. Police! Open up, LT Davis bellowed. No response, only a low, guttural moaning from within, punctuated by wet, tearing sounds. It wasn't human speech. It wasn't an animal. It was something primal. Horrifyingly wrong. Ramirez, breach. The hydraulic ram slammed against the door frame with a deafening crack. Wood splintered. Second hit, and the door flew inwards, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The smell hit us then, thick cloying, the scent of a slaughterhouse mixed with decay and filth. The entry team flowed in, weapons lights cutting through the gloom. Booker and I took up positions covering the rear exit and scanning the upper windows. My M4 felt secure in my grip, sight picture steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Training kicked in, overriding the nascent panic. Scan sectors. Identify threats. Control breathing. Gunfire erupted from inside. Sharp, controlled bursts. M4 and MP5 signatures. Then, shouting, "Contact! Multiple hostiles! Non-responsive!" Chen's voice strained over the comms. They're eating him. Ramirez. Sounding shaken. That wasn't like Ramirez.
Morsha choke scream.
LT, Chen's down. He's bitten. Oh God, Marcus, he's bitten. My blood ran cold. Bitten? Like some kind of rabid animal? Training protocols flashed through my mind. Contamination. Biohazard, but nothing fit this. Booker, with me. Move. I yelled, breaking cover and sprinting towards the main entrance. Booker tight on my 6. We piled into the hallway, the stench overwhelming. The scene was apocalyptic. 2 figures, barely recognizable as human, lay contorted on the floor, riddled with bullets. Their skin was pale, greyish, eyes milky white or shot through with blood. Clothes torn, bodies unnaturally thin, yet moving with jerky, impossible speed before they were put down. Near the stairwell, LT Davis was wrestling with a third figure, this one wearing the tattered remains of a security guard uniform. The LT fired his sidearm point, blank into its chest once, twice, 3 times. It barely flinched, continuing to claw and snap at him with inhuman strength. teeth bared in a blood-flecked snarl. Ramirez was kneeling beside Chen. Chen wasn't just down, he was thrashing on the floor, eyes rolling back in his head, foam flecking his lips. A ragged, deep bite mark oozed dark blood on his neck, just below his helmet strap. He just turned. Ramirez stammered, weapon trained on Chen, his usual stoicism shattered. 1 minute he was yelling, the next his eyes. Chen's thrashing intensified. A low moan escaped his lips, transforming into a high, pitched, keening shriek that wasn't his voice. His body arched impossibly, bones seeming to crack and reset. Then, with terrifying speed, he lunged, not at Ramirez, but towards the LT who had just managed to dispatch the security guard creature with a final shot to the head. Chen, no, Ramirez screamed. Instinct took over. My M4 came up. Sight picture on Chen's rapidly moving form. Threat identification teammate compromised. Immediate lethal threat to another officer. The calculations were automatic, ingrained by years of training, but pulling the trigger felt like tearing out a piece of my own soul. Crack, crack, crack. 3 rounds, center mass. Chen stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward. He hit the floor hard, twitched once, and then lay still. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing and the distant, escalating chaos outside. We stood there, the 5 of us reduced to 4, surrounded by carnage and the impossible. The air tasted like death and disbelief. What the hell was that? Booker whispered, his voice trembling. LT Davis, breathing heavily, wiped gore from his faceplate with a gloved hand. His eyes met mine. The usual certainty was gone, replaced by a chilling mixture of horror and grim resolve. I don't know Booker, but it's not PCP. He keyed his mic. SWAT 1 to dispatch. We have multiple hostiles down, officer down. Requesting immediate medical evac for Officer Chen. Negative evac. Officer Chen is KIA. His voice broke slightly on the last word. We have encountered multiple individuals exhibiting extreme aggression, resilience to standard incapacitation methods, including gunfire. They appear cannibalistic. Be advised, potential biohazard risk. Anyone bitten appears compromised, turns hostile rapidly. Repeat, bites lead to rapid hostile transformation. The radio exploded. Dispatch to all units. Citywide alert! Multiple reports matching SWAT 1's description! Downtown, West End, University campus! This is not isolated! Unit 7, under attack! Warehouse district! They're coming through the walls! Unit 21, trapped in the mall. Hundreds of them. They're breaking the glass! Dispatch, this is Chief Miller. Activate emergency broadcast system. Initiate city lockdown protocols. All off-duty personnel report immediately! This is not a drill! Code Omega! Repeat, Code Omega! Code Omega! The designation we'd only ever discussed in worst-case scenario briefings. Full-scale societal breakdown. Martial law. A situation so catastrophic it defied conventional response. It was happening. Now. Team, listen up. LT Davis's voice regained some of its command authority, cutting through the panicked radio chatter. Chen is gone. We honor him by surviving. We stick together. Ammo check, casualty assessment. Ramirez had a deep scratch on his arm from deflecting one of the creatures. Booker had taken some shrapnel from the breaching charge, minor leg wound. The LT seemed physically unharmed but emotionally rocked. I was untouched, physically at least. Mentally, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under the world. We moved back to the Bearcat. LT Davis ordered, "We need information. Regroup. Assess the citywide situation. Standard withdrawal formation. Mac, you take point." Moving back through the apartment building was surreal. More moaning sounds echoed from upper floors. Doors rattled in their frames. We didn't clear the building. That wasn't the mission anymore. The mission was survival. Outside, the scene had worsened exponentially. More civilians running blindly. More figures moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait, drawn by the noise and carnage. They ignored injuries that would cripple a normal person. Headshots seemed to be the only reliable way to stop them. Patrol officers were engaged in desperate firefights, their formations breaking down under the sheer number and ferocity of the attackers. We moved fast, tactically, covering sectors, communicating with hand signals and curt commands. Reaching the Bearcat felt like reaching an oasis, albeit one parked in the middle of hell. We piled in, Booker covering our six, until the heavy rear door hissed shut, sealing us temporarily from the madness. The interior smelled of sweat, blood, fear. Ramirez slumped against the wall, staring blankly at Chen's empty seat. Booker was trying to field, dress his leg wound, hands shaking. LT Davis was on the main comms unit, trying to get a clear line to command, his face grim. I sank onto a bench, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. My M4 rested across my lap, feeling heavier than it ever had before. I looked at my hands gloved, steady, but I could feel the tremors underneath. 12 years in SWAT, hostage rescues, drug raids, barricaded gunmen, child's play. This was different. This was extinction knocking on the door. The radio painted a picture of a city tearing itself apart. Emergency services overwhelmed. Communications breaking down. Reports of military mobilization. Quarantine zones being discussed. Then overrun. It was happening too fast. Faster than anyone could have predicted. Command's gone dark, LT Davis said, slamming his fist on the console. Dispatch is barely holding it together. Frequencies are chaos. He looked at us, his team, the men he was responsible for. New orders survive. Get back to the precinct. It should be the most fortified position in the city. We can regroup, rearm, figure out what the hell our next move is. The Bearcat rode back to life. We pulled away from Elm Street, leaving behind a scene of utter horror, the flashing lights of abandoned patrol cars, swallowed by the growing darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The drive back was a nightmare obstacle course. Abandoned cars clogged the streets. Fires burned unchecked, casting flickering orange light on scenes of unimaginable violence. People attacking people with savage ferocity. Figures feasting on the fallen. We saw things I can't unsee. A mother turning on her child. Neighbors tearing each other apart. The thin veneer of civilization stripped away in minutes, revealing something ancient and predatory beneath. We engaged targets only when necessary to clear our path, conserving ammunition. Each shot felt like confirmation that the world we knew was irrevocably gone. By the time we reached the precinct headquarters downtown, full daylight had broken, but the sky seemed unnaturally dark, haze with smoke from dozens of fires. The precinct itself was a fortress under siege. Barricades made of cruisers and dump trucks were being hastily erected. Gunfire echoed sporadically from the upper floors and the surrounding streets. Panicked civilians clamored at the barricades, begging for entry, while overwhelmed officers tried to maintain some semblance of order. Inside the perimeter, it was organized chaos, wounded officers being triaged, ammunition being distributed, radios crackling with desperate pleas for help that likely wouldn't come. We disembarked the Bearcat, pushing through the throng towards the main entrance. The familiar building felt alien, transformed into a desperate bastion against the apocalypse. We were back at base, but it didn't feel safe. It felt like the Alamo, moments before the final assault. I found a spot against an interior wall, near the armory entrance. Stripped off my helmet, the cool, recycled air feeling clammy on my sweat-soaked hair. Ramirez, Booker, and the LT were conferring nearby, voices low and urgent. I automatically began a field strip of my M4, cleaning imaginary flecks of dust, needing the familiar routine. The rhythmic clink of metal parts was drowned out by the cacophony outside screams, gunfire, the incessant, guttural moaning of the infected. It was the sound of our world dying. My name is Marcus Riley. I'm a SWAT operator, and 12 hours ago, my shift began. It feels like a lifetime. We thought we were the solution. Now we're just trying to survive the first 24 hours. The sun is high in the sky, but the real darkness is just beginning to fall, and I don't know if any of us will see the dawn. The rhythmic snick, clack of my M4's bolt sliding home was the only sound I allowed myself to focus on. Field stripping and cleaning my weapon, it was muscle memory, a small island of predictable routine in an ocean of utter madness. Around me, the Oak Haven Police Department headquarters pulsed with a panicked energy that vibrated through the concrete floor. It wasn't the controlled tension of a command center anymore. It was the frantic thrum of a besieged outpost on the edge of oblivion. Wounded officers lay on makeshift beds, blankets spread across briefing room tables, conference room floors. Their groans mingled with the hushed weeping of civilian survivors, huddled in corners, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Patrol officers, their uniforms stained with sweat and God knows what else, argued in low, urgent tones, gesturing wildly. Empty ammo boxes were piling up near the armory door, a stark visual reminder of our dwindling capacity for defense. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, the acrid smell of gunpowder residue, and the sore stink of fear. Overhead, the emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting shifting, unreliable shadows that made everything seem more threatening. The main power grid was clearly unstable. And beneath it all, the constant, horrifying soundtrack filtering in from outside the endless, collective moan of the infected, punctuated by shattering glass, distant gunfire, and screams that ended too abruptly. It was the sound of O'Cavan dying. I finished reassembling my rifle, the familiar way to small comfort. Snapping the magazine back in felt decisive, even if I knew it was just delaying the inevitable. I found the rest of my team near the main dispatch consoles, LT Davis hunched over a radio, trying to raise anything, beyond the city limits. Ramirez was leaning against a wall, staring at the floor, occasionally touching the now bandaged scratch on his arm. Booker was attempting a grim joke with a couple of patrol cops, but the laughter sounded forced, hollow. Anything, LT? I asked, keeping my voice low. Davis shook his head, running a hand over his tired face. Static. Tried state police frequencies, military emergency channels, neighboring county sheriffs, nothing. Either the airwaves are completely jammed, or there's no one left to answer. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot but focused. What we're getting locally is fragmented, panic. Reports indicate the major highways are blocked. Military tried setting up checkpoints, got overrun. Same story from West O'Cavan, North Point the infection. Whatever this is, it wasn't localized. It hit everywhere fast. So we're on our own, Ramirez said flatly, voicing the thought none of us wanted to admit. Looks that way, Davis conceded. Right now. This building is the only secure location we know of. Command structures shattered. Chief Miller hasn't been heard from since that Code Omega broadcast. As ranking officer on site, he trailed off, the weight of responsibility settling visibly on his shoulders. We hold this ground. Fortify. Conserve resources. Try to figure out what we're dealing with. Figure out. Booker scoffed, his attempt at humor gone. They're bloody monsters, LT. Fast, strong, don't feel pain, and one bite turns you into one of them. What else is there to figure out? Their weaknesses. Booker. I interjected, my tactical training kicking in despite the surreality. We know headshots work reliably. Body shots slow them, but don't stop them unless you inflict massive trauma. They seem drawn to noise movement. Are they intelligent? Do they coordinate? Can they be deterred by anything other than lethal force? Observations suggest minimal intelligence. Davis mused. Primal aggression, pack mentality when gathered, but no obvious tactical coordination. They just swarm. He pointed towards the main entrance, where officers were piling furniture against the reinforced glass doors. And they don't seem deterred by much. Which means our only option is to make this place impenetrable. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity, fueled by adrenaline and the primal urge to survive. LT Davis, leveraging his authority and our SWAT team's expertise, began imposing some order on the chaos. We became the architects of our own potential tomb. Riley, Ramirez, take your team, supervise fortification of the ground floor, Davis ordered. Every window, every door, reinforce it. Use everything: desks, file cabinets, riot shields, anything heavy. We need layers of defense. Booker, coordinate ammo distribution from the armory, he continued. Strict rationing. Rifle rounds prioritized for perimeter defense. Shotguns for internal choke points. Sidearms as last resort. Count every bullet. We set to work. My team moved with practiced efficiency, directing rattled patrol officers and even able, bodied civilians. Heavy steel desks were dragged across floors, wedged against doors. File cabinets, emptied of their now useless paper contents, were stacked high against ground floor windows, blocking line of sight and adding mass. We used breaching tools in reverse, reinforcing hinges, bracing frames. Riot shields were tied together to create makeshift barriers in wider corridors. We established fields of fire from the upper floors, designating primary and secondary firing positions, covering the main approaches to the building. We cleared internal hallways of clutter, creating choke points where defenders could theoretically funnel attackers. It was textbook siege preparation, applied to a situation ripped from a nightmare. Throughout it all, the psychological strain was immense. You saw it in the eyes of the survivors, the 1,000-yard stares, the sudden bursts of panicked sobbing, the arguments flaring up over a bottle of water or a perceived slight. A young patrol officer, barely out of the academy, broke down completely, dropping his weapon and curling into a ball, whispering about his family. We had to disarm him, gently, and move him to the makeshift triage area, another drain on already limited resources. I checked on my own team periodically. Ramirez was quiet, focused, his movements precise, but there was a darkness in his eyes I hadn't seen before. He kept glancing at the bandage on his arm. Booker masked his fear with relentless work and morbid jokes, but his hands trembled slightly when he reloaded his weapon. LT Davis seemed to be everywhere, coordinating, making hard decisions, his face a mask of strained professionalism. And me, I focused on the task at hand, analyze the threat, secure the perimeter, conserve ammunition, protect the team, protect the civilians. The mantra of SWAT, twisted into a desperate prayer for survival. But flashes kept breaking through the wall of professional detachment, Chen's face as he turned. The blood-soaked hallway on Elm Street, the things we'd seen on the drive back. The sheer, overwhelming wrongness of it all threatened to crack my composure. I forced it down. Compartmentalize. Survive. The relative quiet, if you could call the constant background moaning quiet, was shattered mid-afternoon. It started subtly. The ambient moaning outside began to swell, rising in pitch and volume, coalescing from a dispersed chorus into a focused, terrifying roar. Then came the impacts, thump, thump, thump. Heavy, rhythmic blows against the main entrance doors, the barricaded windows. Contact! Front entrance! The shout echoed down the main hall. Positions! LT Davis roared over the internal comms channel we'd established. All units, hold your fire until you have a clear target. Conserve your ammunition. Headshots only. I took my designated position on the second floor mezzanine overlooking the main lobby, M4 resting on the reinforced railing. Booker was 50 feet to my left, Ramirez covering a side staircase. Below, officers crouched behind overturned desks and makeshift barriers, weapons trained on the main doors. The impacts intensified. The reinforced glass, designed to stop bullets, began to spiderweb under the relentless assault. Not from weapons, but from sheer brute force. Dozens, maybe hundreds of fists, bodies, shoulders slamming against it. The metal frame of the door began to buckle inwards. They're coming through. Someone screamed. With a final, deafening shriek of tearing metal and shattering glass, the main doors burst inwards, and they poured in. It wasn't a charge, it was a flood. A wave of pale, grey bodies propelled by mindless hunger, stumbling, clawing, surging forward over the initial barricades. Their eyes were milky white or blazing red, mouths stretched in silent snarls, guttural moans ripping from their throats. They ignored the debris, climbed over their own fallen, driven only by the need to reach the living flesh inside. Fire! The precinct lobby erupted in controlled chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed in the dim light. The roar of shotguns, the sharp crack of rifles, the bark of sidearms filled the air. Spent casings rained down on the tiled floor. The first wave of infected crumpled under the concentrated fire, headshots dropping them instantly, body shots staggering them, but often failing to stop their relentless advance. From my vantage point, I picked targets methodically. Sight picture, breath control, trigger squeeze. Headshot. Threat neutralized. Acquire next target. Repeat. My training was a lifeline, keeping the panic at bay. But the sheer number of them was staggering. For every one we dropped, 2 more seemed to push forward, clambering over the growing pile of bodies at the entrance. They weren't fast like the initial ones we encountered on Elm Street, not individually, but their collective momentum was terrifying. A shambling, unstoppable tide of death. Some wore remnants of police uniforms, others civilian clothes, tattered suits, hospital gowns, pajamas. Neighbors, colleagues, strangers, all reduced to this. "Side entrance! They're hitting the side entrance!" A panicked yell over the comms. "Ramirez! Check side!" LT Davis ordered. "On it!" Ramirez responded, disappearing down the stairwell. The fight in the lobby intensified. They were pushing past the initial kill zone, forcing the defenders back step by step. Shouts turned into screams as officers were overwhelmed, dragged down into the writhing mass. The air filled with the stench of cordite and fresh blood, overlaying the ever-present smell of decay. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the West Wing corridor, closer than it should be. Ramirez's shotgun boomed repeatedly. They breached the West Wing. Ramirez yelled over the comms, his voice strained. "Loading dock door gave way! They're inside the building! Need backup! Booker, Mac, with me?" LT Davis shouted, already moving towards the West Wing stairs. "Hold the lobby line," he ordered the remaining officers. We moved fast, navigating corridors slick with something. The sounds of fighting grew louder, snarling, gunfire, screams. We rounded a corner and saw Ramirez, back against a wall, his shotgun empty, fending off 3 infected with the butt of his weapon. One lunged, jaw snapping inches from his face. "Ramirez!" Booker yelled, firing his M4. 2 rounds took the closest attacker in the head. It dropped like a stone. I engaged the second, double, tapping its skull. LT Davis took down the third with precise shots from his sidearm. Ramirez stumbled back, gasping, reloading his shotgun with shaking hands. "Thanks," he choked out. "That door wasn't reinforced enough. They just smashed through it." "How many got in?" Davis demanded. "Dozen, maybe more. Scattered down the hallways." "All right," Davis said, his jaw set. "SWAT team, clear the breach. We sweep these corridors, eliminate hostiles inside the wire. Patrol units." He spoke into his mic. "Pull the lobby at all costs. We're dealing with an internal breach." What followed was a nightmare hunt through the familiar corridors of our own headquarters. We moved as a unit, clearing corners, checking rooms, the beam of our weapon lights cutting through the gloom. The emergency power flickered, plunging us into near darkness, punctuated by strobing flashes. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. We found them in break rooms, offices, even the evidence lockup. Former colleagues, people we'd shared coffee with hours ago, now reduced to mindless, predatory husks. Putting them down felt grotesque, a violation, but hesitation meant death. Ramirez's shotgun was brutally effective in the close confines, clearing rooms with deafening blasts. Booker and I provided precision fire, covering angles. LT Davis directed our movements, calm under unimaginable pressure. We cleared the West Wing, floor by floor, leaving a trail of bodies behind us. The cost was steep. We found 2 patrol officers dead, caught unaware by the breach. Ammunition expenditure was heavy. By the time we returned to the lobby, the initial assault wave had been repelled, the entrance choked with the dead, but the defenders were exhausted, traumatized, and dangerously low on ammo. A grim silence fell over the precinct, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the distant, ever-present moaning from outside. The immediate threat was over, but the victory felt hollow, temporary. LT Davis ordered an immediate situation report. The numbers were grim. Nearly a third of the officers who had made it back to the precinct were now dead or wounded. Medical supplies were virtually gone. The civilian survivors were terrified, some bordering on hysteria, and the ammunition count, Booker's report was chilling. "Maybe 2 full reloads per rifleman, LT, he said, his voice low. "Shotgun shells are down to a handful each. Sidearm mags, maybe 3 per officer, if we're lucky. We can't hold off another push like that." The realization settled over us like a shroud. This precinct wasn't a fortress, it was a trap. A concrete tomb waiting to be sealed. We had bought ourselves some time, but we hadn't won anything. I walked over to one of the reinforced upper floor windows, peering through a gap in the barricade. Smoke choked the sky, turning the afternoon sun into a dull orange smudge. Below, the street was littered with bodies, but beyond them movement. Figures shuffling, gathering. The horde wasn't dispersed, it was consolidating, learning, adapting. Or just drawn by the lingering scent of the living within these walls. The moaning seemed louder now, deeper, more resonant. As if countless throats had joined the chorus. L.T. Davis found me there, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. "They're gathering again, Riley," he said quietly. "I see them, L.T." Held them off this time. Next time, he didn't need to finish the sentence. He sighed, leaning his forehead against the cool metal barricade for a moment. "Just got a fragment of a broadcast from a military shortwave somebody rigged up. Mentioned evacuation corridors, designated safe zones outside the city limits. But the transmission cut out before they gave locations. It's a long shot, maybe non-existent by now, but it's something." He straightened up, his command presence returning, though teamed with desperation. "Staying here is suicide. We defended this place, but we can't hold it. We're out of time, out of ammo, out of options within these walls." He looked at me, then towards where Ramirez and Booker were tending to their gear. "Get your team. Meet me in the briefing room, what's left of it. We need a new plan. Now." The concrete walls suddenly felt tighter, the air harder to breathe. We had survived the first major assault, survived the breach, but looking out at the growing sea of the dead, knowing what little we had left to fight them with, one thing was terrifyingly clear. The fight for the precinct was over. The fight for survival was just beginning, and our fortress had become our prison. We had to get out. But getting out looked just as impossible as staying in. The briefing room was a wreck. Bloodstains painted abstract Rorschach patterns on the walls and floor where the triage had failed. Overturned chairs lay scattered like fallen soldiers. In the center, illuminated by the harsh beams of a couple of heavy, duty flashlights laid flat on its surface, was a map of Oak Haven and the surrounding counties. Around it stood the remnants of leadership: L.T. Davis, myself, Ramirez, Booker, a grizzled patrol sergeant named Miller, whose squad had been decimated, and Dr. Evans, the only surviving physician from the makeshift clinic, her face pale and drawn. "All right," L.T. Davis began, his voice low and raspy, cutting through the relative quiet within the room, a quiet that only amplified the incessant moaning from outside. "Let's not sugarcoat this. We're fucked if we stay. The assault we just repelled cost us nearly everything. Sergeant Miller confirms ammo counts are critical across all remaining patrol officers. Dr. Evans is out of sutures, antibiotics, plasma, everything. The building's integrity is compromised at the loading dock and likely other points we haven't found." Another concerted push. He didn't need to finish. We all knew. This precinct wasn't a fortress, it was a besieged tomb, and the dead were patient undertakers. The broadcast fragment I mentioned. Davis continued, tapping the map near Highway 7 North, miles beyond the city limits. Military shortwave talked about designated evac points. Sounded like they were falling back, trying to establish corridors out of major population centers. It cut off, but Highway 7 North was the last vector mentioned. "It's a ghost story, LT." Miller grunted, wiping grime from his face. "Could be static interference, could be wishful thinking. Could be a broadcast from yesterday, already overrun. It's the only lead we have, Sergeant," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "Staying here is certain death. Trying to reach that potential evac zone is a chance. A slim one, but it's better than zero. And how do we get there?" Booker asked, leaning over the map. "Bearcat's fuel line took shrapnel during the retreat from Elm Street. Jury, rigged repair might not hold for 50 yards, let alone 50 miles, and it drinks fuel we don't have. Motor pool," Ramirez suggested, his voice quiet but firm. "Impound lot adjacent. Armored prisoner transport vans. Slower than the Bearcat, less protection, but maybe functional." The plan began to solidify, born of desperation. It was ugly, brutal, and relied on a dozen things going right in a world where everything had gone wrong. Phase 1. Diversion. Draw the bulk of the horde congregating outside towards the front of the building. Ramirez, with his knack for improvisation, suggested using the last of the precinct's emergency generator fuel, combined with confiscated materials from the evidence lockup flares, maybe some accelerants to create a significant fire and series of explosions near the shattered main entrance. Phase 2 escape. While the horde was hopefully distracted, a designated team would exit via the previously breached, now partially resecured, loading dock area at the rear. We'd have to clear any stragglers and cut our way out. Phase 3. Transport. Secure viable vehicles from the motor pool, specifically aiming for 2 armored police transport vans. Sergeant Miller knew a patrolman, Jenkins, who used to be a mechanic before joining the force. He'd be crucial for getting them running quickly. Phase 4 Exodus. Drive like hell. Navigate the city ruins, get to Highway 7 North, and follow it as far as fuel and fate allowed, praying the fragmented broadcast wasn't a phantom. The hardest part came next to who goes. The vans, even if we found 2, couldn't hold everyone left in the precinct, maybe 30 officers and double that number of terrified civilians. L.T. Davis made the call, his face like stone. Essential personnel only. The escape team would be Core Scott, myself, Ramirez Booker. L.T. Davis would command. Sergeant Miller representing the patrol survivors. Jenkins the mechanic. Dr. Evans. A handful of other officers deemed critical for defense or specific skills, totaling perhaps 20 personnel. We could take maybe 10 civilians, prioritized by skills or lack of injury. The selection process was agonizing. Telling terrified families they were being left behind, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. There were tears, bleeding rage. A man spat at L.T. Davis. A woman clung to my armor, begging me to take her child. We had to physically pull people away, enforcing an order that felt like a death sentence. Each face we left behind felt like another weight added to my soul, already burdened beyond measure. We were saving ourselves, perhaps, but the cost was monstrous. We spent the next hour in frantic preparation. While Ramirez gathered materials for the diversion, Booker and I redistributed the last of the rifle ammunition amongst the chosen escapees. We filled canteens from the emergency water supply, knowing it might be the last clean water we'd see. Dr. Evans packed a small bag with the pitiful remnants of her medical supplies. Jenkins gathered tools. We moved with grim purpose, the faces of those being left behind haunting our periphery. Ramirez set his charges near the lobby, a network of siphoned gasoline containers linked by flare, ignited fuses. He gave the signal a sharp nod. We retreated towards the loading dock, hearts pounding. The explosions weren't Hollywood huge, but they were significant. A deep WHOMPH echoed through the building, followed by secondary pops and the roar of rapidly spreading fire. The concrete structure shuddered. Crucially, the cacophony outside shifted. The groaning mass, the pressure against the walls, seemed to lessen at the rear of the building as the horde surged towards the new stimulus at the front. Now, L.T. Davis commanded. We moved through the darkened corridors towards the loading dock. Jenkins used bolt cutters on the chains, hastily thrown across the breached door. It groaned open onto the loading bay, thankfully clear for the moment, the diversion seemingly working. But the relative quiet was unnerving. We slipped out into the oppressive humidity of the late afternoon. The air stank of smoke and decomposition. The motor pool was 50 yards away, across an open lot littered with debris. We moved fast, scanning constantly. A few stray infected, drawn by our movement, or perhaps just wandering, lurched out from behind wrecked vehicles. Muffled shots from suppressed sidearms, ammo conservation paramount, dispatched them quickly. Jenkins reached the first armored van, Booker covering him. He went to work under the hood, bypassing the ignition. Seconds felt like hours. The sounds of the fire and the horde at the front of the precinct were a constant, terrifying backdrop. Another van sat nearby. Ramirez and Miller started checking it. "Got it!" Jenkins hissed. The first van's engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. A moment later, the second followed suit. Fuel gauges read just under half better than nothing, but terrifyingly inadequate for an unknown journey.
Load up.
Move, move, L.T. Davis ordered, pushing the selected civilians towards the rear doors. We piled in, 20 odd souls packed tight in each vehicle, the heavy doors slamming shut, sealing us in metal boxes. I took the passenger seat in the lead van, driven by Miller. L.T. Davis, Ramirez, and Jenkins were in the second van right behind us. Miller didn't hesitate. He slammed the van into gear, ramming the chain link fence of the motor pool. Metal shrieked and tore. We were out, bursting onto a side street adjacent to the precinct. The scene was apocalyptic. The main street in front of the HQ was a sea of burning debris and writhing bodies, drawn to Ramirez's fiery handiwork. We peeled away in the opposite direction, tires squealing on pavement slick with God knows what. Driving through Oak Haven was like navigating a Bosch painting. Buildings burned freely, casting flickering, hellish light. Cars lay overturned or smashed, signs of panicked flight or violent ends. And the dead, they were everywhere. Shambling, crawling, sometimes gathered in dense, pulsating masses. Sometimes solitary figures lurching from alleyways. We fired sparingly from the van's firing ports, only when infected directly blocked our path or swarmed too close. The sickening thud of bodies impacting the armored sides became a grim percussion accompanying our flight. Miller drove with White, knuckled intensity, swerving around wreckage, occasionally mounting the sidewalk to bypass impassable blockades. In the back, silence reigned, broken only by ragged breathing and the occasional stifled sob from one of the civilians. We passed landmarks I'd known my whole life. The Grand Theatre, its marquee shattered, entrance choked with bodies. City Hall, facade blackened by fire, windows empty sockets. Oak Haven University, where panicked students had apparently made a doomed last stand on the library steps. Wrecked military vehicles, Humvees riddled with bullet holes. An overturned troop transport spoke of the guards' futile attempt to contain the initial outbreak. They hadn't stood a chance. The scale of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just an outbreak, it was a replacement. Humanity had been swiftly, brutally overwritten. Progress was agonizingly slow. We hit traffic snarls even the dead couldn't fully block, forcing detours through unfamiliar neighborhoods that had become death traps. Twice, we were nearly boxed in by converging groups of infected, escaping only through aggressive driving and desperate, controlled bursts of fire that used precious ammunition. The second van scraped heavily against a wrecked bus. But L.T. Davis reported no critical damage over the radio, his voice tight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw at the green sign, riddled with bullet holes, announcing the on-ramp for Highway 7 North. Hope, fragile and faint, flickered in the cramped van. But the highway was no sanctuary. It was a ribbon of asphalt stretching towards the horizon, choked with abandoned vehicles stretching as far as the eye could see. Cars, trucks, RVs, packed solid. The exodus had died here. We were forced onto the shoulder, bumping over debris, the vans tilting precariously at times. Inside some cars, we saw slumped figures. Others were empty, doors flung open, belongings strewn across the seats, testament to a final, desperate flight on foot. And amongst the static vehicles, the dead wandered, drawn by the noise of our engines. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the smoke, filled sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Darkness, absolute and terrifying, began to pool in the landscape around us. Our headlights cut feeble paths through the gloom, illuminating brief, nightmarish vignettes, a figure feasting on something unseen, a lone infected child standing silently by the roadside, eyes gleaming in the beams. We were miles out of the city center now. The density of the dead seemed slightly less, but the desolation felt heavier, the silence between engine roars and occasional gunshots more profound. Miller pointed ahead. Full gauge is nearing the quarter mark, Mac. I checked ours. Same. Maybe an hour of driving left, optimistically. Less if you kept encountering trouble. See if you can raise the LT. I said, my throat dry. Miller keyed the radio. Sweat 2, this is Sweat 1. Status. A burst of static. Then Davis's voice, strained. Status is yellow. Fuel critical. We encountered something back there. Bigger than the others. Faster. Took damage to the rear axle. But we're still rolling. How far do you estimate to anything resembling civilization, Mac? I looked at the map under the dim glow of the dashboard light, then out at the endless stretch of dark highway, choked with the dead and dying remnants of the world we knew. Civilization. LT, I think we left that back in O'Carvin. Ahead, another road sign emerged from the gloom. Rockbridge County Line, 50 miles. 50 miles felt like 50,000. The highway stretched into oppressive darkness, flanked by dense woods where unseen things could be moving. The moaning of the infected seemed to carry further on the night air. Escaping the precinct hadn't been the end of the ordeal. It was just trading one tomb for a longer, more uncertain path through purgatory, and our fuel was bleeding away like precious lifeblood. The unknown horrors of the road ahead felt suddenly, terrifyingly close. Darkness absolute. That's what Highway 7 North became after sunset. Our headlights punched feeble holes in the oppressive black, illuminating the endless parade of abandoned cars like tombstones lining the road. Inside the van, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat, fear, and the faint, coppery tang of drying blood from Booker's patched up leg and Ramirez's bandaged arm. Every creak of the suspension, every crunch of debris under the tires, amplified the tension. The woods on either side felt alive, whispering threats just beyond the reach of our lights. Distant moans carried on the night air, a constant reminder that we were merely intruders in a world that now belonged to the dead. The fuel gauge was our executioner's clock, the needle hovering precariously over empty. Miller, driving with grim focus, finally broke the silence. Next exit, sign said Maple Creek. Gas station marked on the map half a mile off the highway. It's our only shot. Mac. Stopping was madness. We were exposed, vulnerable, a beacon of noise and life in a landscape of death. But the alternative was sitting here, waiting to become metal coffins when the engine inevitably died. All right, I said, the word tasting like ash. Take the exit. Minimal exposure. Ramirez, Booker, you're with me on recon and scavenge. Everyone else stays locked inside, weapons ready. We go fast and quiet. The exit ramp descended into even deeper darkness. Maple Creek was barely a town, more a crossroads. The gas station stood silhouetted against the slightly less black sky, lonely, isolated. Its sign was dark, pumps looking skeletal in the gloom. We cut the engine and headlights 100 yards out, plunging ourselves into near, total blackness. The sudden silence deafening, broken only by our own ragged breathing and the incessant, distant moaning that seemed to permeate the very air. We slipped out of the van, myself, Ramirez, Booker. Moving tactically, using wrecked cars for cover, we approached the station. The stench of stale gasoline hung heavy. Looted shelves were visible through the grimy windows of the small convenience store attached. Doors hung open, swinging slightly in the faint breeze. Check the pumps first, I whispered, pointing towards the diesel pump often used by trucks, potentially larger underground tanks, maybe overlooked by initial panicked looters. Booker covered our backs while Ramirez and I examined the pump mechanism. It was manual override capable, thankfully, but we needed power for the pump itself, or portable cans. Ramirez murmured, nodding towards the dark entrance. Might be cans inside. Water, food too, maybe. We swept the store entrance. Broken glass crunched underfoot. Inside, chaos. Shelves overturned, goods strewn everywhere, the air thick with the smell of decay, and something else. Something cloyingly sweet, like rotten meat. Our weapon lights cut sharp cones through the darkness, revealing dark stains on the floor. Half-eaten food products crawling with insects. Behind the counter, a shape slumped against the wall. Former clerk, likely. Head down, unmoving. Clear. I muttered, scanning the aisles. Ramirez found 2 5-gallon gas cans near the back, miraculously intact. As he grabbed them, a low gurgle came from behind the counter. The clerk wasn't dead. Or rather, he wasn't staying dead. It lunged up, surprisingly fast, face a mask of pale flesh and congealed blood, jaw hanging slackly. Ramirez reacted instantly, bringing his shotgun up, but hesitated. Ammo conservation was drilled deep. The infected clerk stumbled forward, arms outstretched. I raised my M4, sight picture settling on its forehead. Suddenly, a blur of motion outside the window. Something fast. Faster than anything we'd seen. It moved at a jerky, unnatural gait, but with terrifying speed and agility, darting between the wrecked cars near our van. Contact! Booker's urgent whisper hissed over the comms. Something different. Moving fast. Towards the van. Gunfire erupted short, controlled bursts from the van's firing ports. Then, a sickening crunch of metal, a scream cut short. Miller. They got Miller. Jenkins yelled over the radio, panic edging his voice. It's on the roof! Trying to tear its way in. The creature at the counter forgotten. We sprinted out of the store. What I saw made my blood run cold. Clinging to the roof of our van, silhouetted against the faint starlight, was a figure both gaunt and powerful. Limbs seemed too long, joints moving at impossible angles. It moved with a predatory grace utterly unlike the shambling hordes, tearing at the van's roof vent with long, claw-like fingers. Its head swiveled towards us, emitting a high-pitched shriek that cut through the night. Light it up. I yelled, opening fire. My round struck its torso, causing it to flinch, but it didn't go down. It was unnervingly resilient. Ramirez let loose with his shotgun, his last 2 rounds blasting the creature sideways. It tumbled off the van roof, but landed on its feet like a cat, unnervingly agile. It fixed its gaze on Ramirez, eyes glowing faintly red in our flashlight beams, and charged. It covered the ground between them in seconds. Ramirez barely had time to raise the empty shotgun defensively before it was on him, knocking him backward with incredible force. Booker and I fired simultaneously. Rounds ripped into the creature's back and side. It staggered, shrieked again, then turned its attention towards us, ignoring Ramirez on the ground. It bounded forward, impossibly fast. We backpedaled, firing desperately. Headshot. That was the only reliable way. But hitting its weaving head was almost impossible. It lunged, claws swiping, catching Booker across the arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing blood. He cried out, stumbling back. Just as it coiled to strike again, L.T. Davis appeared at the van's side door, firing his sidearm with measured precision. Pop, pop, pop. One round finally struck the creature's temple. It staggered, its movements becoming instantly uncoordinated, before collapsing into a heap. Silence, save for Booker's pained gasps and Ramirez groaning as he pushed himself up. We stared at the thing on the ground. It was fundamentally different. More predator than plague victim. Faster, stronger, maybe smarter. A terrifying evolution of the threat. Everyone okay? Davis demanded, scanning the darkness. Booker's hit, I reported, checking the wound. Deep lacerations, bleeding freely, but hopefully no bite. Ramirez was bruised but functional. Miller was gone, dragged from the driver's seat window before they could react. Jenkins had taken over driving. Forget the fuel, Davis ordered, his voice grim. Get back in the van. We scrambled back inside, dragging the gas cans empty, the brief hope of refueling extinguished. The atmosphere in the van was now thick with grief, pain, and recrimination. Jenkins slammed the van into gear, roaring back onto the highway access ramp, leaving Maple Creek and Miller's body behind. Shouldn't have stopped. One of the civilians sobbed. One needed fuel, Jenkins retorted, his voice shaking. Your variant, LT, Ramirez growled, clutching his bruised ribs. You didn't emphasize how bad those things are. I reported what I saw. Davis shot back, fatigue fraying his command composure. Enough! I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. Fighting each other won't help. Booker, let Dr. Evans look at that arm. Ramirez, check your ribs. Everyone else, stay alert. We keep moving north. Just as despair threatened to consume us entirely, the radio crackled. Not static this time. A clear automated voice, looping, attention. This is an automated emergency broadcast. Evacuation point Delta operational at coordinates 40 degrees, 15 minutes north, 83 degrees, 45 minutes west. State Park Lodge, Highway 7 north vicinity. Zone perimeter may not be secure. Approach with extreme caution. Authentication protocols suspended. Repeat. A stunned silence fell over the van. Coordinates. A destination. Hope, treacherous and fragile, bloomed again. State Park Lodge. That's maybe 20 miles, Jenkins said, consulting a map fragment. We might just make it. Go, L.T. Davis ordered, his voice filled with renewed, desperate energy. Get us there, Jenkins. Those last 20 miles were the longest of my life. The van sputtered, threatening to die at any moment. Every shadow seemed to hold another one of those fast movers. But the automated broadcast, repeating its sterile message of potential salvation, spurred us onward. We turned off the highway onto a narrower state park road. Trees crowded close, branches scraping the van's sides. Signs of recent, fierce fighting littered the roadside, spent military brass, abandoned gear, fresh bodies, both human and infected. Then, we saw it. Perched on a hill overlooking a lake, the massive log structure of the State Park Lodge. It looked imposing, potentially defensible. But it was dark, utterly dark. No lights, no sentries, no sounds of life. Barricades made of parked vehicles and felled trees were visible, but sections were smashed inwards breached. Several military trucks sat derelict near the entrance, doors agape, one still smouldering. Something's wrong, Ramirez muttered, voicing the dread creeping into all our hearts. Jenkins killed the engine, coasting the last 100 yards. The silence was profound, unnatural. No automated broadcast repeating here. Just the wind sighing through the pines and the distant, ever-present moaning from the surrounding woods. Map. Ramirez, Booker, scout it. L.T. Davis ordered, his voice barely a whisper. Careful. We disembarked, moving like ghosts towards the main entrance. The heavy wooden doors were splintered, hanging partially open. We slipped inside, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The cavernous main hall of the lodge was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay everywhere. A tangled mass of army fatigues, civilian clothes, and the greyish, pale forms of the infected. Overturned furniture, scattered equipment, blood smeared on the log walls. It was the scene of a last stand, a failed one. In the center of the room, near a large stone fireplace, was a cluster of dead soldiers around a radio set. One clutched a microphone, his other hand frozen in a final, defiant gesture. On the wall above the fireplace, scrawled in what looked horrifyingly like blood, were 3 words toe fast. Nostoping. The evacuation point had fallen. The automated broadcast was a ghost, an electronic echo unaware its source was long dead. We had chased a phantom hope across a landscape of nightmares, only to arrive at its tomb. I stood there, amidst the carnage, the silence of the lodge pressing in. My breath hitched. 12 years in SWAT, preparing for the worst, but the worst was never supposed to look like this. The structured violence I understood, the tactics, the jeer, it all felt meaningless now. Behind me, Ramirez cursed softly. Booker leaned heavily against the doorframe, his injured arm throbbing, his face a mask of despair. The first rays of the sun began to filter through the high windows of the lodge, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above the dead. It marked the end. 24 hours since my shift began. 24 hours that felt like an eternity, stripping away civilization, camaraderie, hope. I walked back towards the entrance, towards the van where the few remaining survivors waited, their faces pale and questioning in the growing light. What could I tell them? That our last hope was a graveyard. That we were alone, stranded with barely any fuel, dwindling ammo, and predators lurking in the woods, predators that were evolving. My M4 felt heavy and useless. I checked my clock. 21. 5 rounds left in the magazine. I looked out at the silent, sun-dappled woods surrounding the lodge. The distant moaning seemed closer now, perhaps drawn by our arrival, or maybe just the dawn stirring the dead. 24 hours. The initial shock, the fight for survival, the desperate flight. That phase was over. My identity as Sergeant Marcus Riley, Oakham SWAT, felt like a shedding skin, irrelevant. Now I was just a survivor. One of the few left standing on the dawn of a dead world. Shift's over. Welcome to day 1.